June 4th, 1942. 10:22 in the morning. Three of the most powerful aircraft carriers in the Imperial Japanese Navy are on fire. Aboard the Akagi, Japan's flagship, the pride of their fleet, Vice Admiral Chūichi Nagumo receives the reports one after another. Akagi, hit. Kaga, hit. Soryu, hit. In the span of a few minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers have been dealt a fatal blow. The 4th, the Hiryu, is still out there. She is already preparing her counterstrike. But Nagumo, standing among the reports, is not thinking about the Hiryu. He doesn't understand what just happened to the other 3. And he doesn't understand why. Not because he lacked information, not because the Americans had prepared better than he expected, but because of a single sentence written in the dark hours of that same morning, before a single shot had been fired, that no one on his staff had ever questioned. After the war, that sentence appeared in Japan's internal battle records. Then someone removed it. One of Nagumo's own officers, the man responsible for compiling the official report of the battle, quietly left it out. He never told the historians. He never told the authors of Japan's official war history series. He carried that omission for 70 years. And then, in 2012, at the end of his life, he finally told a Japanese historian what he had done. According to the Naval War College Review, published by the United States Naval War College, what that sentence contained was the real reason Japan lost the Battle of Midway. We're going to read that sentence today, but first, we need to talk about the man who wrote the version of Midway that you already know, and why even Japan's own historians stopped trusting him decades ago. Here is something most people don't realize. Everything the Western world knows about what happened on the Japanese side at Midway, every book, every documentary, every film, every YouTube video you've ever watched on the subject, traces back to a single source. One man. His name was Mitsuo Fuchida. If that name sounds familiar, it should. Fuchida was the senior air officer who led the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. He was present on the Akagi during the Battle of Midway, and when the war ended, he was one of the very few senior officers who had been at the center of both attacks and survived to write about them. In 1955, he published a book, Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan. It was translated into English almost immediately. American publishers promoted it. American historians cited it. The 1976 film, Midway, the one with Henry Fonda and Hal Holbrook, drew heavily from his account. For the better part of 5 decades, if you were an American trying to understand what happened on the Japanese side of that battle, Fuchida was your primary source. Most people who've written about Midway in English have built on his account, whether they knew it or not. Now step back for a moment. In 1971, 16 years after Fuchida's book came out, Japan released something called the Senshi Sosho, 102 volumes. It was Japan's official military history of the war, compiled by the Japanese government from internal documents, operational records, and materials that had never been made public. Volume 43 covered the Battle of Midway. It was not translated into English. For decades, 2 versions of the same battle existed side by side, the one Americans were reading, and the one Japan's own historians had produced from their own classified records. They were not the same. Jonathan Parshall spent the better part of 10 years working through Japanese primary sources, documents that had never been used by Western historians writing about the Pacific War. In 2005, he and Anthony Tully published Shattered Sword through the Naval Institute Press. And then, in the spring 2010 edition of the Naval War College Review, the academic journal of the institution that trains America's admirals, Parshall wrote something that is worth reading carefully. He wrote, "Fuchida's impact on the history of the Pacific War has been enormously damaging. in that his elaborations have been parroted for years and handed down as truth on the big screen, on television, and in countless internet chat rooms. That is not a casual opinion from a blogger. That is a trained historian, writing in a peer-reviewed military journal, making a direct and documented case that the foundational account of Midway that Americans have accepted for half a century does not hold up against the Japanese records that actually survived the war. Now, why would Fuchida write something that didn't match Japan's own official documents? Consider the circumstances. He published in 1955. Japan had surrendered 10 years earlier. The Imperial Japanese Navy, an institution that had existed for 70 years, the source of enormous national pride, had been dissolved. The men who served in it had lost. Fuchida wasn't just writing history. He was writing for an audience that had suffered one of the most devastating national humiliations in modern memory. Parshall put it plainly in his research. The goal, he wrote, was to find some sense of national pride that might be regained by revealing some moments of nobility within that defeat. That is not a condemnation. That is a human explanation for why a man shapes a story the way he needs it to be shaped. But the consequence has been that for decades, every American who thought they understood what happened on the Japanese side of Midway was reading a version of events that Japan's own scholars had long since set aside. There is a Japanese official history of the Battle of Midway that most Americans have never had access to. There are internal records, message logs, battle reports compiled in the immediate aftermath of the fighting, documents that tell a different story than the one Fuchida wanted the world to hear. And buried inside one of those documents, in a message log compiled on the morning of June 4th, before the first American bomb fell, is the sentence that was quietly removed, the sentence that one officer carried in silence for 70 years. That's where we're going next. If this is the first time you've heard any of this, you're probably not the only one. If you think someone else should know this story exists, A-like takes about 1 second and puts it in front of people who've never seen it. 8 days before the battle. May 27th, 1942. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton walks into Admiral Chester Nimitz's office at Pearl Harbor and sets a piece of paper on the desk. On it, he has written the following: The Japanese carriers will attack on the morning of June 4th. They will approach from the northwest, on a bearing of 325 degrees. They will be approximately 175 miles from Midway at 7 o'clock in the morning. That's it. Date, direction, distance, time. Nimitz reads it. He doesn't ask for a second opinion. He doesn't wait for Washington to confirm it. He doesn't hedge. He deploys his entire available carrier force, all 3 ships, including the USS Yorktown, which had taken serious damage at the Battle of the Coral Sea less than a month earlier and had been estimated to need 3 months of repairs. Nimitz told the repair crews at Pearl Harbor they had 3 days. They gave him 72 hours. The Yorktown steamed out of dry dock and headed north to meet the Japanese fleet. On the morning of June 4th, as the first American scout reports began coming in, Nimitz turned to Layton and said, "Well, you were only 5 miles, 5 degrees, and 5 minutes off. 5 miles, 5 degrees, 5 minutes, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Now, how does something like that happen? It doesn't happen by accident. It happens because of a deliberate choice Nimitz made about how he wanted to receive information. The Naval History and Heritage Command, the United States Navy's own historical authority, recorded what Nimitz told Layton when he first took command of the Pacific Fleet, in the weeks after Pearl Harbor. He told Layton that his job was to think like Admiral Yamamoto, not to brief Nimitz on what was happening, not to summarize intercepts, not to tell him what the intelligence said, to think like the enemy commander, to get inside his head and tell Nimitz what Yamamoto was going to do next, even when the evidence was incomplete, even when Washington disagreed, even when being wrong would mean career consequences for everyone in the room. That is a very specific thing to ask of an intelligence officer. It means the job is not to confirm. It means the job is to challenge. And Nimitz built his entire pre-battle planning around that principle. According to Proceedings, the flagship journal of the United States Naval Institute, Nimitz and his staff did not simply accept intelligence estimates at face value. They made a deliberate effort to understand the tradecraft behind the estimates they were receiving. Washington, at that same moment, was telling Nimitz he was wrong. The army on Oahu believed the Japanese were coming back to hit Pearl Harbor again. Naval intelligence in Washington thought the attack would fall somewhere in the South Pacific, possibly Australia, possibly the Aleutians. Nimitz listened to all of it. And then he trusted the two men who had spent years living in Japan, learning the language, studying the culture, and reading Yamamoto's communications with their own eyes. Rochefort and Layton, not because they told him what he wanted to hear, because he understood exactly how they had reached their conclusions. There is one more thing worth knowing about how Nimitz operated. In the spring of 1942, Commander Joseph Rochefort, the head of Station HYPO, the Navy's signals intelligence unit at Pearl Harbor, came to Nimitz with an unusual proposal. The Americans were almost certain that the Japanese target was Midway Island, referred to in Japanese communications only by the code letters AF. Almost certain, but not certain enough. Rochefort proposed a test. He would have the garrison at Midway broadcast an unencrypted message, completely open for anyone to hear, reporting that their freshwater distillation plant had broken down. If the Japanese were planning to hit Midway, their communications would almost certainly reference the water shortage. Nimitz approved it. Within hours, American listening stations intercepted a Japanese transmission reporting that their target, the location designated AF, was running low on fresh water. The identity of the Japanese objective was no longer almost certain. It was confirmed. What Rochefort proposed was a trap built out of information. What Nimitz did was say yes, when a less confident commander might have said, "That's too clever, too risky, too unorthodox." Keep that word in mind. Unorthodox, because on the other side of the Pacific, at almost exactly the same moment, a very different kind of meeting was taking place. And the men in that room were not in the habit of saying yes to ideas that challenged the plan. We need to go back to the beginning of June 4th, not 10:22 in the morning, when the bombs were already falling. Earlier, much earlier, 5:20 in the morning, local time. The Kido Butai, Japan's carrier strike force, is steaming toward Midway in the darkness. The first wave of aircraft has already been launched to attack the island. On the bridge of the Akagi, Air Staff Officer Yoshioka Tadakazu is compiling the morning's operational log. He records the weather, wind speed, sea state, visibility, the bearing and speed of the fleet, standard entries. And then, before moving on, he writes one more line, a single sentence recording the staff's intelligence estimate for the day ahead. The sentence read, "It is calculated that the enemy Kido Butai will not be encountered today." The enemy carrier force will not be encountered today. That was the official assessment of Nagumo's staff at 5:20 in the morning on June 4th, 1942. Less than 5 hours later, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were gone. Now, here is what that sentence is not. It is not a tactical error. It is not a failure of nerve. It is not a decision made under pressure by a man who should have known better. It is something quieter than that, and more consequential. According to the Naval War College Review, Spring 2015, published by the United States Naval War College, that sentence is evidence of something that shaped everything that followed on June 4th. The journal's authors wrote, Nagumo and his staff did not expect, and therefore did not even prepare for, contact with an enemy carrier force on the morning of June 4th. Everything that followed flows from this faulty estimate of the situation. Everything that followed. The rearming of the aircraft, the delays, the confusion on the flight decks, the 40 minutes of indecision that everyone has spent 80 years arguing about. All of it flows from one thing: a staff that went into battle without ever genuinely asking whether American carriers might be waiting for them. Not because the question was impossible, because the question was never asked. Think about what Layton was doing at roughly the same hour on the other side of the Pacific. He was sitting with his charts and his intercepts, building a picture of exactly where the Japanese fleet would be, when it would arrive, and what it would do. He had been asked to think like the enemy. On the Akagi, no one had been asked to think like the Americans. The assessment was not a prediction. It was an assumption. And assumptions, unlike predictions, do not require evidence. They only require confidence. Now we come to the second part of this story. The sentence Yoshioka wrote that morning was included in the raw message log. After the battle, when Yoshioka was assigned the task of compiling the official post-battle report, what historians have since called the Nagumo Report, he made a decision. He left that sentence out. He did not misplace it. He did not forget it. He removed it. The official report that went up the chain of command, the report that would become part of the permanent record of the Imperial Japanese Navy, did not contain the line that said the staff had not expected to find American carriers that morning. And then, decades later, when Japan was compiling its official war history, the Senshi Sosho, the 102-volume series drawn from internal military records, Yoshioka did not tell the historians about it then either. According to the Naval War College Review, the omission was not even disclosed to the writers of the Senshi Sosho. The official history of the war did not know the sentence existed. Yoshioka kept it to himself for 70 years. In 2012, a Japanese historian named Mori Shiro published a book called Midway Kaitsen, Naval Battle of Midway. It contained interviews with surviving participants, some of them released only after the subjects had died. One of the most significant was with Yoshioka himself. In that interview, Yoshioka admitted what he had done. He acknowledged the omission, and he told Mori why. He said he had removed it, in his own words, to protect the Navy's reputation. The Naval War College Review, analyzing his admission, was direct about what the deletion meant, that there had been, among a select group of surviving officers, an understanding about how the defeat at Midway was to be presented to history. The mental unreadiness of the Kido Butai for encountering an American carrier force on the morning of June 4th, that was to be downplayed, suppressed if possible. Instead, the story that would be told was one of misfortune and timing, bad luck, narrow margins, the fog of war, not an assumption that was never challenged, not a staff that went to battle having already decided the Americans wouldn't be there. It is worth pausing here to consider what Yoshioka was actually protecting. By 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy had existed as an institution for 70 years. It had won at Tsushima in 1905. It had surprised the world at Pearl Harbor. Its officers were trained from childhood to believe that the Navy represented something larger than any individual battle. Yoshioka was not protecting himself. He was protecting that. That is not an excuse. It is a fact. And it explains something about why the sentence stayed missing for as long as it did. There is one more layer to this. Japan's own official war history, the Senshi Sosho, Volume 43, contains a finding that sits quietly alongside everything else we've discussed. It concerns the mechanics of what would have had to happen on the Japanese carriers for Nagumo to mount any kind of response, even if he had received a warning in time. The Senshi Sosho states that the procedure for bringing aircraft up from the hangars, positioning them on the flight deck, arming them, fueling them, and preparing them for launch would have taken, at minimum, 40 minutes. 40 minutes, even if Nagumo had known, even if the question had been asked, even if someone on his staff had looked at the intelligence that morning and said, "Wait." The carriers couldn't have responded in time. Which means the problem was not just one sentence in a morning log. It was a system, built entirely around the assumption that surprise would always belong to Japan. A system with no contingency for the morning it didn't. Now consider the 40 minutes of decisions that everyone has spent decades arguing about. Between 7:15 and roughly 8 o'clock that morning, Nagumo received 3 separate pieces of contradictory information in less than an hour. At 7:15, he ordered his reserve aircraft to swap their torpedoes for land attack bombs for a second strike on Midway. His scout planes had reported no American ships in the area. At 7:28, one of his scout planes reported 10 enemy surface ships to the northeast. No carriers mentioned. Nagumo halted the rearming. At 7:45, a follow-up report. One of the ships appeared to be a carrier. Now his flight decks were covered with aircraft in mid-rearm, some with bombs, some with torpedoes, fuel lines running across the deck, ordnance stacked in the open. And his first strike wave was already returning from Midway, low on fuel, needing to land. The Naval War College Review, the same 2015 analysis that identified the deleted sentence, makes a point that is easy to miss in the decades of criticism directed at Nagumo. It states that his decisions, given the information he had at each moment, were not unreasonable. Each individual choice, viewed in isolation, had a logic to it. The problem was not that Nagumo made bad decisions under pressure. The problem was that he was making decisions inside a situation that his own staff's morning assessment had told him would never exist. He was improvising inside a scenario that his command had already concluded was impossible. The sentence that said the American carriers would not be encountered today. That sentence set the frame for everything. It was written at 5:20 in the morning, removed from the record after the battle, hidden from Japan's own historians for 3 decades, and according to the officer who removed it, speaking at the end of his life to a historian who was willing to listen, it was the real reason Japan lost the Battle of Midway. The question worth asking is this: where did that assumption come from? The one written into the morning log. The one that said the Americans wouldn't be there. It didn't appear on June 4th. It was built, carefully, methodically, 5 weeks earlier. May 1st through May 4th, 1942. Aboard the battleship Yamato, anchored at Hashirajima, the most powerful warship ever constructed, Yamamoto's personal flagship, the senior commanders of the Imperial Japanese Navy gathered for a tabletop war game. The formal purpose was to stress test the Midway plan before committing the fleet to it. Find the weaknesses, challenge the assumptions, work out what could go wrong. That was the purpose. What actually happened was something different. On the second day of the exercise, the officer commanding the simulated American forces sent a flight of land-based bombers from Midway Island to attack the Japanese carrier group. The dice were thrown. The result: 9 hits on the Japanese carriers. By the rules of the exercise, that meant 2 carriers were sunk. Akagi and Kaga, the same 2 carriers that would lead the actual attack, were ruled destroyed. The chief umpire of the exercise was Rear Admiral Ugaki Matome, Yamamoto's own chief of staff. Ugaki looked at the result, and then he set it aside. He reduced the number of hits from 9 to 3. Under his revised ruling, Kaga was still sunk. But Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, the ship where Yoshioka would sit down 5 weeks later to write his morning log, Akagi survived. The exercise continued. Later, in the portion of the game covering the operations that would follow Midway, even Kaga quietly reappeared, restored to the Japanese order of battle, as if her earlier sinking had never occurred. Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully, in Shattered Sword, described the 4 days of exercises as a mockery of professional staff work. The Naval History and Heritage Command, the official historical authority of the United States Navy, recorded what happened when the American player attempted something more realistic. At one point during the exercise, the officer playing the American side positioned his carriers to the north of Midway and launched a strike from an unexpected angle. The attack worked. It worked the same way the real American attack would work, 5 weeks later, in almost exactly the same location. The Naval History and Heritage Command noted that his actions were ruled impossible by the umpire, and the Japanese game losses were restored. His name is not recorded in any document that has survived the war. He played the Americans correctly. He was told that wasn't how the Americans would fight, and the planning session moved on. There was one more moment worth knowing about. During the planning meetings that accompanied the exercise, Vice Admiral Kondo Nobutake, commander of the Second Fleet, one of the most senior officers present, asked a direct question. If Japan captured Midway, how would the island be resupplied? The atoll was more than 1,000 miles from the nearest major Japanese base. Keeping it supplied would require a sustained logistical effort that the Navy had not fully planned for. Yamamoto's own chief of staff acknowledged that resupply might not be possible. The question hung in the air for a moment. No one pursued it. Vice Admiral Nagumo, who would command the carrier strike force, said nothing. He had reason to stay quiet. Yamamoto had criticized him sharply for not ordering a third strike at Pearl Harbor, for pulling back when Yamamoto believed he should have pressed. The relationship between the two men was strained. Nagumo was not in a position to challenge the plan. The meeting ended. The plan was approved as written. Kondo's question and the Chief of Staff's answer did not appear in the meeting record. Now hold that image. A planning session aboard the most powerful ship in the world. A war game where unfavorable results were revised until they came out right. An officer who played the Americans correctly and was told his moves were impossible. A direct question about a fatal flaw in the plan that was acknowledged, then dropped, then left out of the record. And then come back to Pearl Harbor. Same weeks, same month, different room. Nimitz is telling Layton that his job, his only job, is to think like the enemy, not to confirm, to challenge. Rochefort is in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters, working through intercepts, and coming to Nimitz with ideas that sound, on their face, unorthodox, like sending a fake message about broken water equipment to trap the Japanese into revealing their own target. And Nimitz is saying yes. There are no umpires overruling the results in the basement of Station HYPO. There is no senior officer adjusting the dice rolls until the outcome matches the plan. The two rooms are not that far apart in time. They are separated by an ocean, and by something harder to measure. On the morning of June 4th, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey is flying at 20,000 feet over an empty stretch of the Pacific Ocean. He is the Air Group Commander of the USS Enterprise. He has been in the air for nearly 2 hours. His fuel is running low. The Japanese fleet is not where it was supposed to be. Nagumo had changed course that morning, the result of evasive maneuvering under repeated American attacks from Midway, and the Kido Butai was no longer where it was expected to be. McCluskey reaches the estimated point of interception and finds nothing. He has no updated position report, No new orders from the Enterprise. No way to know where the Japanese have gone. He has a decision to make. He could turn back. His fuel situation was becoming critical. Every minute of additional searching increased the risk that he and his pilots would run dry before they could land. He chose to keep searching. He extended his flight to the southwest, then turned north, a calculated guess about where the Japanese carriers might have gone. 20 minutes later, he saw something below him, a single Japanese destroyer steaming at full speed toward the northeast. The ship was the Arashi. She had spent the morning attacking the American submarine USS Nautilus, which had been harassing the Japanese fleet, and was now racing to rejoin the main formation. McCluskey watched her bow cut through the water, pointing like an arrow. He followed it. At 10 o'clock in the morning, he spotted the wakes of the Japanese carriers. 22 minutes later, at 10:22, his dive bombers rolled into their attack runs. Nimitz later described McCluskey's decision, the choice to keep searching, to extend the flight, to follow the destroyer, as having decided the fate of our carrier task force and our forces at a Midway. That is not a small thing to say about one man's choice on a morning when everything was uncertain. McCluskey had no orders for that situation. No one had told him what to do if the Japanese weren't where they were supposed to be. He made a judgment call. And it worked. That afternoon, dive bombers from the Enterprise located the Hiryu and left her burning without the ability to launch aircraft. She was scuttled the following morning. By June 5th, all 4 Japanese carriers were gone. What happened next is less often told. Before the surviving Japanese ships had even returned to port at Hashirajima, before the fleet had anchored on June 14th, senior Navy officers were already discussing how the battle would be presented. Jonathan Parshall, writing in Naval History magazine in 2007, documented what followed. The official announcement to the Japanese public described Midway as a victory. 2 American carriers had been sunk, it said. Japan had prevailed. The Akagi and the Hiryu, both at the bottom of the Pacific, were kept on the Navy's official roster, listed not as sunk, listed as unmanned. Sailors who had been wounded at Midway were separated from the general hospital population. They were not allowed to communicate with their families. They were not permitted to tell anyone what had happened. Not a single admiral was relieved of command. Not Yamamoto. Not Nagumo. The institution closed around the defeat the way water closes around a stone, and Yoshioka, sitting down sometime after the battle to compile the official report, made his own small contribution to that effort. He removed a sentence. One sentence, the one that would have shown, in the Navy's own words, written by one of its own officers, at 5:20 in the morning before a single shot had been fired, that the staff of the Kido Butai had already decided the Americans wouldn't be there. On the morning of June 4th, as the first scout reports confirmed that the Japanese fleet was exactly where Layton said it would be, Nimitz turned to his intelligence officer and said, "Well, you were only 5 miles, 5 degrees, and 5 minutes off." Layton had told him the fleet would be 175 miles from Midway. It was 180. He had said bearing 325 degrees. It was 320. He had said 7 o'clock in the morning. It was 5 minutes past. 5 miles. 5 degrees. 5 minutes. In the middle of an ocean that covers a third of the Earth's surface. That is what it looks like when an institution builds a system designed to find the truth. Even when the truth is inconvenient. Even when Washington disagrees. Even when the answer changes the plan entirely. On the other side of that ocean, an institution built a system designed to protect the plan, even when the war game said it would fail, even when an officer asked a question that had no comfortable answer, even when the morning log recorded an assumption that the enemy would simply not appear. The assumption was wrong, and the man who wrote it down spent the rest of his life making sure no one would know. Yoshioka kept quiet for 70 years. A lot of the men who were actually there did the same thing. If someone in your family served in the Pacific, what did they tell you about it? Or what did they never talk about? Those silences say something too. Leave it in the comments. I'm asking because I genuinely want to know.
June 4th, 1942, a carrier deck in the Pacific. A Japanese officer stands with a pen in his hand, writing down another of the morning's victories. His navy has not lost a battle in 6 months, and far above him, past clouds he has no reason to look up at, the thing that is about to erase that navy is already there. Unseen, all morning the Americans have come at his fleet, wave after wave, low over the water, and all morning he has watched them fail and fall and burn. He writes each one down. Attack repelled, attack repelled. He is sure he is winning, and he is right, for about 5 more minutes. How does the best morning in the history of a navy become its worst, in the time it takes to finish a paragraph? You already know how the battle ended. That was never the question. The question is what this one man could see from where he stood, and the one thing, right in front of him, that he never saw coming. He was writing it down as it happened, he just didn't know what he was writing. His name was Takahisa Amagai. He was the air officer aboard the carrier Kaga, and on the morning of June 4th, his job was to keep the record of the sky. Every plane that went up, every plane that came back, every report that reached the deck from the ships around him. It was a good job for a careful man, and Amagai was a careful man. You can picture the deck below him, the morning sun already high, the sea calm and open in every direction, sailors moving with the ease of men who have done this 100 times and never once been wrong. A carrier at work is a kind of clockwork. Planes spotted and ranged, engines run up, men in colored jerseys moving through a dance they know in their bones, each one trusting the next to do his part exactly the way he has always done it. That morning, the clockwork was running clean. Men who have been winning for 6 months carry themselves a certain way. There is a looseness in it, an ease, orders given quietly and followed at once. The steady confidence of a crew that has never yet had a reason to doubt the deck beneath its feet, or the man standing next to it. You would have felt it the moment you came aboard. It was in the air of that ship, the way the salt was. There was no fear on that deck. There was no reason for any. The page in front of Amagai told a simple story, and every line of it was correct. The strike they had sent against the island that morning had gone out and come home. The enemy planes that had found the fleet had been met and beaten and sent into the sea. The sky was theirs, the water was theirs, the morning was theirs. A careful man reads his own account, and this one said one word, over and over, in a hand that did not shake: winning. And the calm on that deck had roots that ran back much further than that single morning. That book did not begin on the morning of June 4th. It began 6 months earlier, and it had never once been interrupted. At Pearl Harbor, this same fleet had crossed 4,000 miles of empty ocean, in radio silence, and struck the American battle line where it lay at anchor, then slipped away over the horizon before the smoke had cleared. Then Wake Island, then Rabaul. Then Darwin on the northern coast of Australia, where the bombs came down on a harbor that had told itself it was too far south to ever be touched. Then west, all the way into the Indian Ocean, where this same fleet chased another empire's navy out of its own home waters and sank its ships almost as an afterthought. 6 months, a quarter of the way around the world. And in all of that time, against every navy that came at them, these carriers had not lost a single one of their number. Not one. The men on these ships were not the kind who bragged. They did not have to be. At that moment, they were very likely the finest carrier force in the world, the best trained crews, the most experienced pilots, flying from the decks that had already done what no navy in history had ever done. And there was something older and deeper than experience holding that confidence up. For the better part of 40 years, the Japanese Navy had trained for a single idea, one great battle. One morning when the enemy fleet would be found and met and destroyed in open water, the way they had destroyed the Russian fleet a generation before, in a victory the whole nation still taught its children. Every admiral in that navy had grown up on that story. That was the dream this navy had been built around. Everything in it, the ships, the guns, the training, the pride, pointed toward that one decisive morning. And on June 4th, from where Amagai stood, it looked as though the dream was finally coming true. The enemy had come to them. The enemy was being destroyed. The record was writing itself out exactly the way that doctrine had promised it would. That is the cruelest part of all of it. He was not misreading the morning by the standards he had been handed. He was reading it perfectly. The standards were the trap. So when Amagai stood on the Kaga and watched the Americans come and fail and watched his fleet hold, he was simply reading the newest line in a book that had never once told a lie. He had every reason on earth to believe the next line would read like all the others. That is what makes what happened next so hard to look away from. The Americans came at the fleet in waves all morning long, and each wave was worse for the men flying it than the one before. First came the planes from the island itself, early, before the day was fully warm. They came in, and they were thrown back. Then, as the morning wore on, came the ones that would decide everything, though no one on either side knew it yet, the torpedo planes. What it took to fly one of these attacks is the heart of the whole story. A torpedo has to be dropped low and slow and straight. There is no other way to do it. The plane has to come down almost to the surface of the sea, hold a steady line, and fly directly at a ship that is doing everything in its power to kill it. For long seconds, the pilot cannot turn. He cannot climb. He can do nothing but hold that line and pray. The American torpedo squadrons flew these attacks that morning without a single fighter to protect them. The men who led them knew exactly what that meant. One squadron commander took his men down toward the Japanese fleet, fully understanding that most of them, perhaps every last one of them, were not coming back, and they followed him anyway, in a straight line, into the guns. Think about what that asks of a man. Not a single flash of courage, a long-held, deliberate courage, seconds stretching out while the fire comes up to meet you, and the only thing you are allowed to do is keep flying straight at the thing that is killing you, because to turn away is to make the whole sacrifice mean nothing. They did not turn away. From the deck of the Kaga, it must have looked almost like a mistake, like watching men walk willingly into a fire. These planes had no chance, and every sailor at every gun could see it. The Japanese fighters fell on them from above. The guns of every ship in the fleet came around and opened up, and the torpedo planes came apart over the water, one after another, and went into the sea, squadron after squadron. First one carrier's planes, then another's, then a third's, over the better part of an hour. Almost none of the men in them lived. Amagai wrote it down. Attack repelled. Another squadron bored in. The same thing happened. Attack repelled. And here is what not one man on that deck could see. Those low, doomed, hopeless-looking attacks were not the failure they appeared to be. They were part of the reason the sky was about to fall in. To meet those planes down on the water, the Japanese fighters had come down too, all of them, down low, spread out of position, and, after a long morning of killing, low on fuel and low on ammunition. The high air, the air that a dive bomber falls out of, had been left open. Nobody had planned it that way. The Americans, still climbing far above, did not even know it had happened. It was not a scheme. It was the accidental price of an hour of slaughter. But the door had been left open, and it was the men in the torpedo planes, the men now going into the sea, who had left it open. They died buying something they would never live to see. One of them was a young pilot who had already dropped his torpedo, taken his hits, and gone down into the water in the very middle of the Japanese fleet. He was alive down there, wounded, hidden, holding on. The officer on the deck above never knew he was there. Remember him. We are going to come back to him. Those men in the torpedo planes never knew what their attack set up. Most of them never came home to find out. If you think they have earned a few seconds of being remembered, take one of those seconds right now and tap the like button. It is a small thing, but it is one of the ways a story like theirs stays out loud instead of going quiet. Now, back to the deck. The officer is still writing. He has about 3 minutes. The first thing that was wrong was the quiet, not silence. A carrier at battle stations is never silent. But something in the rhythm of the morning had slipped, the way a familiar song slips when one note comes in a half-beat late. The fighters that had filled the air with noise were somewhere else now, down low, off across the water, chasing the last of the torpedo planes, far from the ships they were supposed to be guarding. For a stretch of minutes, the sky directly over the fleet had almost no one minding it. Somewhere on the deck, a man tilted his head back and looked up. Maybe he shouted, maybe he only pointed, and could not find the breath to say what he saw. On the ships of that fleet, there was no machine that could look into the high air for him. No radar, nothing that reached up past the clouds to warn a captain what was already on its way down. There was only a man's eyes, and the sky, and however many seconds were left in it. Seconds. That is what it came down to in the end. Not the 6 months, not the 4,000 miles, not the decades of doctrine. Just a handful of seconds, and whether anyone happened to be looking up into the one part of the sky that no one had thought to watch, Amagai may have glanced up himself. A careful man would have. And then, most likely, he looked back down at his record, because the record was still true, and the morning was still theirs, and there was still a line to finish. The pen kept moving. High above the Kaga, an American named Wade McCluskey had brought his dive bombers over the fleet, looked down, found the enemy carriers with no one guarding the air above them, and tipped over into his dive. The men on the deck had a handful of seconds left. They did not know it yet, but they did. I have read a great deal about those 5 minutes over the years, and the detail that has always stayed with me is not the bombs. It is that a man had just finished writing the word for victory and never got to write the next line. What happened to the Kaga happened fast, too fast to lay out in order, because the men who lived it could not have told you the order of things either. One moment, the deck was a place where a careful officer kept a careful record. The next moment, the world tilted. The sound arrived before the mind could put a name to it. The light changed. The steady deck stopped being steady. The bombs came down out of that open high air, the air no one had been watching, and they found a ship that had no answer left to give. Up on the bridge, the captain of the Kaga, a man named Jisaku Okada, did not survive the first minutes. The place from which the ship was commanded was simply gone, and the record, the careful record, the true record, the 6-month record that had never once had to write the word lost, it went with it, into smoke, into a heat that no pen and no paper survive. Amagai lived. The air officer, The man who had spent his whole morning writing down victories came through those first terrible minutes when so many around him did not, and because the men above him were gone, what was left of the ship became his to command. Think about that turn for a moment. The last thing he had done as a keeper of records was write that his side was winning. The first thing he did as a commander of men was try to save a ship that could not be saved. In the space of about 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's carriers had been torn open to the sky. The Kaga, the Akagi, flagship of the whole fleet, the Soryu. And Amagai was not the only man keeping that book. On every one of those ships, that same morning, someone else was writing the same word he was. An officer on the Akagi, an officer on the Soryu. Careful men, honest men, all of them reading the same true page and reaching the same true conclusion. They were all winning. Every one of them was right, and every one of those records ended within minutes of the others, in the same smoke, under the same open sky. By that same evening, a 4th carrier would follow the first 3. For a few hours, that 4th ship, the Hiryu, fought on alone. She had been just far enough from the others to slip the first blow, and her own plane struck back hard, and for a little while the men aboard her may have let themselves believe the morning could still be pulled back from the edge. It could not. Late in the day, the same open sky found her too. One by one, all through that long afternoon, the ships that had carried the pride of a navy across the world went dark and began to burn. The force that had crossed a quarter of the earth without losing a single carrier lost 4 of them between breakfast and dark. And the hardest part, the part that is almost too neat to be believed, is that the record had been right, all the way up to the final line. They really had been winning, right up until the instant they were not. What came after the noise was a different kind of hard. A ship that is dying does not die all at once. It gives its crew time to fight for it, and slowly, time to understand that the fight is already lost. Amagai had that time. He led men back toward the fires to do what could still be done, to save the ship that had been the solid ground under his feet only an hour before, back when that ground had felt like the safest place in the entire world. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. There is no record of what a man thinks while he does a thing like that. Amagai never left us one, and it would be wrong to invent one for him. But what was true is clear enough, whether he ever let himself put it into words or not. Every certainty he had carried onto that deck at sunrise was gone by the middle of the day. The book that had never lied had ended in the middle of a sentence. The sea that had been theirs was filling with their own ships, burning, and the quiet confidence of that entire fleet, all 6 months of it, had turned out to rest on one single thin assumption, that the next line would look like all the ones that had come before. By nightfall, the arithmetic was beyond any argument. The heart of the fleet was gone. The men who could not be replaced, the veteran crews, the trained hands, the pilots a nation had spent years building one at a time, were in the water or beneath it. 6 months of running wild had ended in 5 minutes of a single morning, and no line written in any book could put a word of it back. So here is the question we started with, and here, at last, is the answer. How does the best morning in the history of a navy become its worst, in the time it takes to finish a paragraph? It was never really about the battle. You knew the battle before you ever clicked on this. It was about the distance between what a record can measure and what is actually happening. Amagai's record was honest. Every line of it was true. The strike launched. The attacks repelled. The sea held. But a record can only ever write down what a man is able to see. And there was one thing that careful officer could not see: the open door up in the high air, and the men who had died to hold it open for the ones coming behind them. His instruments could not measure that. His doctrine could not imagine it. His own eyes could not reach that high. So he wrote victory. And he was telling the truth. And the truth was a trap. Now, that young pilot in the water, the one I asked you to remember, he had gone in with the torpedo planes. One of 15 his squadron flew off the carrier Hornet that morning, behind a commander who led them straight at the fleet. Of those 15 planes, of those 30 men, he was the only one who came back. Shot down, wounded in the arm and the leg, he had pulled himself free of a sinking plane in the middle of the enemy fleet and hidden in the open water beneath a seat cushion that floated loose, small enough and still enough that no one found him. And from down there, from inside the very fleet he had been sent to attack, he watched. He watched 3 of the carriers his squadron had come to attack, the Kaga, the Akagi, the Soryu, turn, one by one, into towers of black smoke that leaned up against the sky. He stayed in that water for 30 hours before an American flying boat finally spotted him and lifted him out. He was burned, and he was shot through, and he had spent a day and a night watching an enemy die all around him. And when they pulled him from the sea, he was still holding on. He would carry what he saw in that water for the rest of his life. He had been handed the strangest seat in the whole battle, a seat down inside the enemy's own fleet, low on the water, close enough to hear it happen, close enough to watch the smoke climb, and know exactly what it meant. He had done exactly the thing those men in the torpedo planes were sent to do. He had gone in against the odds. He had helped hold the door open. He had paid for it. And, almost alone among them, he had lived to see it work. The record on the Kaga never wrote his name. It never wrote down what he and his squadron had truly done, because the man keeping it could not see it, and by the time anyone on that ship might have understood, the record was already ash. But it happened. It is one of the truest things in this entire story. And the fact that his enemy's careful book never once recorded it does not make it one bit less true. It only tells you that the record was never the place where the truth was living. We tell this story from the deck of the Kaga for a reason. Not to stand in an enemy's shoes and feel sorry for him. He chose his war, and his navy chose the morning it sailed into. We tell it from up there because it is the only place you can truly see the size of what those American flyers did. You cannot measure it from the American side. From the American side, it looks like a run of terrible luck and a wave of good men lost. It is only from the enemy's own deck, from the pen of a man writing victory while his navy has minutes left to live, that you can see the truth of it plainly. The men who beat that fleet did not look, at the time, like they were winning. Right up to the end, they looked like they were losing. That was the disguise the whole thing wore, and it worked. Every carrier that burned that afternoon had sailed to that spot to fight one great battle and win it. They got their great battle. It simply belonged to someone else. And the men it belonged to, the ones in the low, slow planes, the ones who flew straight into the guns so that others could come falling out of the empty sky behind them, most of them never knew they had won anything at all. They were gone before the smoke even rose. That is the true shape of what happened over that ocean. Those men handed the war forward, at the highest price there is, and trusted the rest of us to understand, later, what they had done. That officer spent a morning writing down a war he was certain he understood. The one thing he never managed to write, the thing his book simply had no line for, was the men who reached up into an open sky and turned his entire morning over. Their names deserve to be said out loud. So let us keep saying them. That officer's morning survived because someone wrote it down. But some of the best stories from this war were never written down at all. They were told once, at a kitchen table, by a father or a grandfather who was there, and who only ever mentioned it the one time. If you carry a story like that, something he told you that you have never read in any book, put it in the comments below. Write it down here, where it won't disappear. Those men counted on us to remember them. Let's make sure we do. At 9:11 in the morning on October 25, 1944, Vice Admiral Kurita Takeo stood on the bridge of Yamato, the largest warship ever built, and ordered his fleet to turn north. He was 45 miles from Leyte Gulf. He had 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Between him and the Gulf stood a handful of small escort carriers and their screens, ships that had been running from him for the past 2 hours, taking losses, burning. He was winning. 6 minutes after ordering his fleet to consolidate, he ordered a full withdrawal. In the 8 decades since that morning, naval historians, strategists, and veterans of the Pacific War have returned to those 6 minutes again and again, not because the decision was complicated, because it was not. The numbers were clear. The objective was within reach. The opposition was outmatched. And yet, the easy explanation is that Kurita broke under pressure. The harder question, the one that does not resolve cleanly, is what breaking under pressure actually looks like in a man who has lived through 2 days of sustained combat, who has already survived having his flagship sunk beneath him, who has watched the most powerful warship in the Japanese Navy go under, and who is standing on a bridge receiving radio signals that no one is answering. To understand those 6 minutes, you have to understand the 72 hours that produced them. It begins not at the entrance to Leyte Gulf. It begins 3 days earlier in the darkness of the Palawan Passage when the first torpedo hit. The morning of October 23, 1944. Center Force, Japan's most powerful remaining surface fleet, was moving through the Palawan Passage, heading northeast toward the Philippines. Kurita was on the bridge of Otago, his flagship, the ship he had commanded through the campaigns that had brought Japan's Navy to this point. At 6:32 in the morning, the first torpedo hit. USS Darter and USS Dace had found Center Force the night before. They had tracked it through the darkness, reported its position, and moved into firing range before dawn. Darter put 4 torpedoes into Otago. The ship was gone in less than 30 minutes. Kurita went into the water. Not metaphorically, not in the way that commanders lose ships from a distance and absorb the news from a chart room. He was in the sea. His flagship was sinking around him and he was swimming. He was pulled from the water and transferred to Yamato. In the same engagement, USS Dace sank the heavy cruiser Maya. Darter put 2 torpedoes into Takao, leaving her too damaged to continue, forcing her to turn back toward Brunei. 3 heavy cruisers gone or crippled before Center Force had fired a single shot in the operation it had been assembled to fight. There is no record of what Kurita said or felt in those hours. The historical record preserves his orders, his signals, his reported positions. It does not preserve what it was like to begin the largest naval operation in history by swimming away from your sinking flagship. What the record does preserve is what came next. October 24th, the Sibuyan Sea. Center Force entered the confined waters between the Philippine Islands, moving northeast, still on course for San Bernardino Strait. American carrier aircraft found them before noon. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a sustained aerial assault, multiple attack waves over the course of 8 hours, against a fleet that had no air cover. Japan's carriers were far to the north, part of a separate operation. Kurita had no fighter protection. He had anti-aircraft guns and the ability to maneuver, and nothing else. The aircraft kept coming. Yamato was hit twice by bombs. Nagato was hit. Haruna was hit. And then there was Musashi. Yamato and Musashi had been built to be the final argument, the ships so large, so heavily armored, so thoroughly engineered that no combination of conventional weapons should have been able to sink them. Japanese sailors called them hotels, not because of any particular comfort, but because they were so large, so well provisioned, and so rarely committed to actual combat that they seemed more like installations than warships. On October 24th, that changed. Musashi absorbed more than a dozen torpedo hits and at least 17 bomb strikes over the course of the afternoon. She was a ship of more than 65,000 tons. She went under at 7:36 in the evening. Kurita watched this from Yamato's bridge. He had already lost his flagship that morning. He had spent hours on a ship being attacked by waves of aircraft he could not fight back against effectively. And now, the ship that was supposed to be unsinkable, the ship that represented the outer limit of what Japanese naval engineering could produce, was gone. At approximately 3 in the afternoon, Kurita turned center force around. He had been ordered to proceed to San Bernardino Strait. He reversed course anyway. His reasoning, as recorded in subsequent communications, was the sustained air attack and the losses his force had taken. Tokyo ordered him to turn back. At approximately 5:15 in the afternoon, he reversed course again, back toward San Bernardino Strait, back toward the original mission. This reversal, this moment of turning back and then turning back again, is rarely examined in the accounts of Leyte Gulf that focus on the larger battle. It should be. It is the first visible indication that Kurita's decision-making that day was not operating in a straight line. A commander who turns back and then unturns back within 2 hours is a commander receiving conflicting pressures from above, from the situation, from whatever was happening inside his own assessment of what was possible and what was not. He continued northeast through the night. San Bernardino Strait. The narrow passage between Luzon and Samar that Center Force needed to transit to reach Leyte Gulf. American naval doctrine and common sense suggested it would be defended. It was not. Admiral Halsey had taken his carrier fleet north, drawn by the decoy operation Ozawa was running with Japan's remaining carriers. The strait was open. Kurita did not know this. He transited in darkness, expecting contact, expecting resistance, finding neither. What he found instead was open water and the coast of Samar ahead of him as the sky began to lighten on the morning of October 25th. Consider what Kurita carried with him into that dawn. His flagship had been sunk beneath him less than 48 hours earlier. He had spent 8 hours under sustained air attack with no ability to strike back. He had watched Musashi, the most powerful ship in the Japanese Navy, go under. He had reversed course under pressure, and then reversed again, under different pressure. He had transited a strait he expected to be defended in darkness, not knowing whether the ships waiting at the other end were destroyers or an entire carrier task force. He had sent radio signals through the night. No one had answered. Whether Kurita slept in those hours is not recorded. What is recorded is the sequence of events he had lived through, and the man that sequence had produced by the time the sun came up over Samar. That man was about to make the most consequential decision of his life. He had approximately 3 hours before he would have to make it. At 6:45 in the morning on October 25th, a lookout on Yamato reported masts on the horizon, then flight decks, then the unmistakable silhouette of aircraft carriers. Kurita had not expected this. The plan had assumed he would transit San Bernardino Strait undetected and arrive off Leyte Gulf before significant American naval forces could respond. What he was looking at, or what he believed he was looking at, suggested the Americans had known he was coming. He was looking at Taffy 3, a task unit whose primary purpose was providing air support for the Leyte landing operation, not fighting surface engagements against battleships. Kurita did not know that. What he saw through his binoculars in the early morning light, with smoke beginning to rise and the small ships accelerating away at their maximum speed, did not look like escort carriers and destroyer escorts. The flight decks were real. The wakes of the fleeing ships were long and fast. Aircraft were launching from the carriers in the confusion of the moment, climbing away at steep angles. His pilots had reported fleet carriers in the area. His charts showed this was a reasonable place for them to be. The ships ahead of him were running hard. Escort ships running at full speed through heavy seas, laying smoke. They do not look like small ships. They look like what they are doing, which is fleeing at full speed, and full speed in bad conditions looks, at distance, through binoculars, in the early morning light, like something considerably larger and more dangerous than what they actually were. He ordered general attack, not a coordinated assault with designated targets and sequenced firing lines. General attack, the order that releases each ship to engage the nearest enemy independently, without waiting for a unified battle plan. It was the order of a commander who did not have time or did not have enough information to issue something more specific. Each of his ships went after whatever it could see. What followed was 90 minutes of combat that looked, from the Japanese side, like a victory in progress. Yamato's guns were firing at carriers. The carriers were taking damage. The smaller American ships, the destroyers and destroyer escorts, were doing something that no tactical manual adequately prepared anyone to expect. They were attacking Johnston, Hole, Samuel B. Roberts, 3 small ships that had no business charging a force of battleships and heavy cruisers. They charged anyway. They fired their guns. They launched their torpedoes. They drove directly at ships 10 times their size and forced those ships to maneuver, to break formation, to change course, to respond to a threat that should not have been threatening. Kurita's carefully assembled force was spending its time maneuvering against destroyer escorts instead of closing on the carriers. Yamato herself was forced to turn away from a torpedo spread, the largest warship in the world, spending critical minutes running from a ship a fraction of her size. He had ordered general attack, which meant he had lost centralized control of his force. His ships were scattered across miles of ocean, each pursuing its own targets, each generating its own smoke and wakes and radio traffic. He was receiving fragments. Pilots reported hits on fleet carriers. Ship commanders reported engaging cruisers. The radio traffic was heavy, confused, and contradictory. And through all of it, American aircraft were attacking, from the carriers, from other nearby units, climbing through the smoke and coming back around. Chokai was hit and left dead in the water. Chikuma was hit and left dead in the water. Suzuya was damaged and falling behind. 3 heavy cruisers, gone or effectively gone, in the same engagement where he believed he was sinking fleet carriers. By 9 in the morning, the tactical picture had simplified in one respect. Taffy 3 was still running, still taking damage. One of the carriers was visibly dying. The destroyers that had attacked him so aggressively were now themselves damaged or sinking. He was winning. The Gulf was 45 miles to the south, and then the picture complicated in every other respect simultaneously. A radio signal, received, not fully confirmed, suggested a substantial American carrier force was operating to the north. The chain of command in Tokyo had not answered his signals. His force was spread across miles of ocean with no coherent formation. He did not know how many aircraft the Americans had left. He did not know what was waiting in Leyte Gulf. He did not know where Halsey was. He did not know that the answers to most of those questions, had he known them, would have told him to continue south. At 9:11 in the morning, he ordered his fleet to consolidate, to gather, to stop the scattered pursuit and come back together into something that resembled a coherent force. It was a reasonable order. It was also the moment when continuing south became, for the first time, something other than automatic, because consolidating, pausing, meant making a decision. And the decision, when Kurita finally made it 6 minutes later, was not the one the map suggested. In the minutes after that order, the situation on Yamato's bridge was this. The firing had not stopped. American aircraft were still coming in. The radio was producing a steady stream of reports from ships scattered across miles of ocean. Damage assessments, position updates, requests for instruction that Kurita could not yet answer because he did not yet know what to instruct. He was trying to see the whole picture. The problem was that the picture had too many pieces, and some of them were wrong. Start with what he knew. He knew Taffy 3 was hurt. One of the carriers was burning and slowing. The destroyers that had attacked so aggressively were themselves damaged or gone. The carriers were still running south, but they were taking hits. He knew he had lost 3 heavy cruisers, Chokai, Chikuma, and Suzuya, gone or effectively gone. That was a cost he had not anticipated paying against what he had believed were fleet carriers and heavy cruisers. Against escort carriers and destroyer escorts, it was a cost that did not make sense. He knew the Gulf was within reach. Those were the things he knew. Now consider what he did not know. The picture he was working from was wrong in almost every important respect. Halsey was not closing from behind. He was hundreds of miles to the north, chasing Ozawa's decoys. The strait behind him remained open and undefended. The landing force he had been sent to destroy had largely dispersed, the transports unloaded, the major vessels gone, and the carrier force, the radio signal warned him about to the north, did not exist in the form the signal implied. Each of those facts, had he known them, pointed in the same direction. Together they would have told him, the way is open, the objective is within reach. Continue south. He knew none of them. The chain of command that had sent him here had gone silent. He was making a decision about a battlefield he could not see, using information that was hours old, with no guidance from above. The first pressure pulling at his decision was the accumulated weight of everything that had come before. Not panic, not a dramatic collapse. Something quieter and more insidious, the way that prolonged stress narrows a mind's capacity until the full range of options is no longer available to it. A commander who has absorbed the loss of his flagship, who has spent 8 hours under air attack with no ability to strike back, who has watched Musashi go under, that commander does not process new information the way a rested commander does. He processes it faster and less completely. He reaches conclusions sooner with less examination of alternatives. This is not weakness, it is physiology. The second pressure was the signal about the carrier force to the north. He could not confirm it, he could not deny it. What he could do was calculate what it meant if it was true. If there was a substantial American carrier force moving south toward him, if Halsey had not taken the bait, had not gone north, was instead closing from behind, then continuing into Leyte Gulf meant sailing into an enclosed space with an enemy fleet cutting off his exit. The logic of the threat was sound. The threat itself was not real. But Kurita had no way to know that. The third pressure was the question of what, exactly, he would find in Leyte Gulf. He had been sent to destroy the American landing force, the transports, the supply ships, the vessels that had put troops on the beach and could put more. But the landing had happened. The troops were ashore. The transports, if they followed standard practice, had unloaded and moved on. What was left? He had no current intelligence on the contents of Leyte Gulf. The mission that had been the justification for sending Center Force through everything it had come through was based on a picture of Leyte Gulf that may no longer have been accurate. The fourth pressure was the one he articulated most consistently across every account he gave after the war. He believed he had been fighting fleet carriers. He had been told there were fleet carriers in the area. The ships he had engaged were running, taking damage, launching aircraft from flight decks he could see with his own eyes. If those were fleet carriers, if he had spent 90 minutes engaging fleet carriers and had damaged or sunk several of them, then he had already accomplished something significant. And if that was true, then the calculus of continuing south looked different. Not because Leyte Gulf was not worth reaching, but because the cost of reaching it, against an unknown number of American aircraft with a degraded force, into waters whose contents he could not confirm, while a carrier fleet he could not locate might be closing from the north. That cost looked different against the backdrop of a mission he believed he might have already partially accomplished. These four pressures did not arrive in sequence. They did not present themselves one at a time, clearly labeled, waiting to be evaluated and resolved. They arrived simultaneously, tangled together, each one affecting how the others looked. A man, under less cumulative stress, might have separated them, might have said, "The carrier threat to the north is unconfirmed. Weight it accordingly." Might have said, "Leyte Gulf intelligence is old, but the mission objective does not change because the intelligence is old." Might have said, "The ships I have been engaging are escort carriers, not fleet carriers. I can tell by now, after 90 minutes, from the damage patterns, from the size of the aircraft, from the weight of the defensive fire." A rested man, with a functioning command structure, receiving current intelligence, might have said all of those things. Kurita said none of them. At 9:17 in the morning, he ordered Center Force to withdraw to the north. The order was clean, direct, and final. There was no recorded hesitation in its transmission. Whatever combination of exhaustion and bad information and isolation and miscalculation had produced the decision, it arrived on the radio as a clear command. And Center Force turned. 45 miles to the south, Leyte Gulf waited. What was in it and what was not in it, Kurita would not learn until after the war. The war ended 10 months later. Kurita survived it. And when the American officers of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey sat down with him in the autumn of 1945, they asked him the question that everyone who had studied the battle would spend the next 80 years asking. "Why did you turn back?" he answered. He answered in 1945, and he answered again in subsequent interviews over the following decades, and the answers he gave were not the same, not wildly different, not contradictory in ways that suggested deception, but different enough that historians working from his testimony have reached 4 distinct conclusions, each one supportable, none of them complete. The first conclusion is the one that feels most obvious from the outside. Kurita turned back because the previous 72 hours had reduced his capacity to make sound decisions. The evidence for this is not direct. There is no document in which Kurita says he was too exhausted to think clearly because no commander says that about himself. The evidence is circumstantial and cumulative. His decision to reverse course in the Sibuyan Sea, and then reverse again 2 hours later, suggests a command mind under competing pressures it was not resolving cleanly. His order for general attack at the start of the Samar engagement, releasing centralized control at the moment when centralized control was most needed, suggests a commander defaulting to a broad directive when a specific one would have served better. And the decision itself, turning away from an objective that was within reach, with opposition that was running from him, is the kind of decision that is very difficult to explain through any purely rational calculus. The argument against this conclusion is that Kurita continued to function. He issued orders. He managed the withdrawal. He brought most of center force back intact. What he may have experienced is something more precise and more difficult to measure, not collapse, but a narrowing, until the full range of options was no longer available to him. The second conclusion rests on what Kurita said most consistently. He believed he was engaging fleet carriers. In his survey interrogation, and in later interviews, he returned to this point repeatedly. The ships he had seen had flight decks. His pilots had reported fleet carriers in the area, the aircraft coming off those decks, the wakes of the ships running from him. It all fit the picture of a fleet carrier engagement. The argument for this conclusion is that the confusion was genuinely possible. Escort carriers are not small ships. In poor visibility at the opening of an engagement with smoke and spray and the chaos of a force that has just gone to general attack, misidentification is not stupidity. It is the normal condition of combat. The argument against it is time. By 9 in the morning, Kurita had been fighting Taffy 3 for more than 90 minutes. 90 minutes is long enough to observe that the aircraft coming off those carriers are not the type carried by fleet carriers. Long enough to observe that the defensive fire from the screening ships, while aggressive, is not what heavy cruisers produce. Long enough to correct the initial misidentification. Whether he did or whether the original impression had fixed itself too firmly to be revised under those conditions, he never said directly. The third conclusion is the one he stated most explicitly, and the one that is hardest to evaluate because it depends on information he did not have. He turned back because he believed a carrier force was approaching from the north. In his telling, this was not a vague anxiety. It was a specific tactical concern that continuing south into Leyte Gulf would expose center force to attack from the rear by a fleet he could not see and could not confirm. The signal that suggested this carrier force was real enough to act on. The problem is that the signal was wrong. Halsey was hundreds of miles away. There was no carrier fleet closing from the north. If Kurita had known that, if anyone had told him that Halsey had taken the bait, that San Bernardino Strait remained unguarded, that the way south was open, the calculus changes entirely. He did not know, and the particular weight of this conclusion is that it represents a rational response to false information, a sound decision made on a foundation that did not exist. The fourth conclusion is the one that is most uncomfortable for those who want the story to be simple. Some historians, working from the operational record rather than Kurita's testimony, have argued that he made a deliberate and defensible strategic choice. The landing at Leyte had already succeeded. The troops were ashore. The transports had unloaded. Destroying what remained in the Gulf would not reverse what had already happened on the beach. His force had taken significant losses. 3 heavy cruisers gone. Yamato's ammunition was not unlimited. American air power had already demonstrated what it could do to his ships in open water. In this reading, Kurita looked at the cost of continuing and the benefit of continuing and concluded that the benefit did not justify the cost, not because he was broken, not because he was confused, not because he was misled, but because he made a calculation and the calculation came out negative. The argument against this conclusion is his own behavior after the war. A commander who made a clear strategic decision, one he believed was correct, tends to defend it. Kurita did not defend it. He explained it differently in different conversations. He expressed no certainty about it. A man who turned back because he had reasoned his way to a clear conclusion does not spend 30 years giving inconsistent accounts of how he reached it. What the 4 conclusions share, the thread that runs through exhaustion and misidentification and false intelligence and deliberate calculation, is that none of them, alone, is sufficient. The decision was not produced by a single cause. It was produced by a man, a specific man, in a specific condition, holding specific information that was partly wrong, receiving no guidance from above, in command of a fleet that was scattered and damaged and still being attacked from the air. That man made a decision. And the decision cannot be fully separated from everything that had made him that man by 9:17 on that particular morning. Kurita's chief of staff, Koyanagi Tomiji, was present on Yamato's bridge throughout the engagement. After the war, he wrote that the withdrawal could not be reduced to a single explanation, that the reasons were multiple, and that no single one of them was sufficient by itself. Kurita Takeo lived until December 19, 1977, 33 years after Leyte Gulf. He did not write a memoir. He gave interviews when asked, to historians, to journalists, to the occasional naval officer working through what had happened in the Pacific War and why. In those interviews, across 3 decades, he was consistent about the facts, the timeline, the signals, the losses, the order to withdraw. He was not consistent about what those facts meant, or what had produced the decision that sat at the center of all of them. In some accounts, he emphasized the carrier threat from the north. In others, he spoke more about the losses his force had already taken. In at least one late interview, he suggested that the landing had already succeeded and that there was nothing in Leyte Gulf worth the cost of reaching it. He never settled on one explanation. He answered the question every time it was asked. He never answered it the same way twice. What he arrived at in those minutes cost Japan the last serious opportunity it had to disrupt the American return to the Philippines. Whether it also saved the lives of the men remaining in center force, whether the American air power that would have met him in Leyte Gulf would have finished what it had started in the Sibuyan Sea, is a question that has no answer, because it is a question about something that did not happen. Leyte Gulf is recorded as the largest naval battle in history. It was decided by many things, by Halsey's decision to follow Ozawa, by the extraordinary actions of the ships of Taffy III, by the logistical achievement of the American landing itself. But at its center, at the hinge point where the battle could have gone differently, is a man on a bridge at 9:17 in the morning, making a decision, alone. Whether it was the right decision is a question Kurita himself refused to answer definitively. He lived 33 years with it. He turned it over in his mind enough times to produce a different account of it each time he was asked. And in the end, in the last interviews, in the final years, he said he did not know. Not as an evasion, not as the false modesty of a man who had made his peace with a difficult choice, but as the honest conclusion of a man who had spent 3 decades examining that decision and had found, at the end of all that examination, that certainty was not available. 45 miles. The distance between Kurita's position at 9/11 on October 25, 1944, and the entrance to Leyte Gulf. 2 hours of sailing, perhaps less. The distance between what happened and what might have happened. It is, in the end, the distance that defines him, not the battles he fought, not the ships he commanded, not the losses he absorbed on the 2 days that preceded that morning. The distance he did not cross. And the question, still open after 80 years, of what was waiting on the other side. It was 9:27 in the morning on December 13th, 1943. Second Lieutenant Philip Adair, 23 years old, a pilot from Oklahoma serving with the 89th Fighter Squadron of the 80th Fighter Group, had just completed his 43rd combat mission and was preparing to land his Curtiss P-40N Warhawk when the red alert siren began to wail across Denyen Airfield in Assam, India. Without hesitation, he turned and ran to his aircraft, nicknamed Lulu Bell, and marked with the number 44 on its tail. There was no time to strap on a parachute or buckle into the seat. In 60 seconds, the big Allison engine roared to life, the propeller bit the air, and he was airborne, climbing hard into the clear morning sky. At 18,000 feet, he spotted the formation. At first, it appeared to be only 4 aircraft sliding through the haze 3 miles east, but as he gained altitude and his eyes adjusted, the full scale became clear. 24 Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally bombers flying in tight combat Vs of 3, each carrying over 2,200 pounds of bombs, escorted by approximately 40 Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar fighters layered above and below the bomber stream. 64 aircraft in total, moving at 240 miles per hour straight toward Denjan. Adair immediately keyed his radio. "Denyan Tower, this is Lulu Bell 44. I have a large enemy formation 3 miles east of the field, altitude 10,000, heading west. 24 bombers and approximately 40 fighters. Request immediate fighter support." The reply came back crackling. Control insisted the Japanese were still 40 miles out and that he must be seeing their own planes. Adair replied calmly but firmly, "Negative. I am looking right at them. I am the only friendly fighter airborne. I am engaging." 38 minutes until the nearest reinforcements could arrive. Below him lay 14 C-47 Skytrains loaded nose to tail with critical supplies for Chiang Kai-shek's forces in China. Beside the runway stood a field hospital treating 63 wounded American soldiers. Fuel stocks, sufficient to keep the entire hump airlift running for 11 more days, were stored nearby. If those bombers reached the target unopposed, the damage would cripple Allied supply operations over the Himalayas for weeks, perhaps months. The stakes could not have been higher. Adair faced 64-1 odds. Standard doctrine called for fighter pilots to wait for reinforcements when outnumbered more than 5-1. He could have radioed for help and shadowed the formation from a safe distance until support arrived. By then, the bombs would already be falling. Instead, he pushed the throttle forward. The Allison V-1710 engine responded immediately. Manifold pressure climbed to 54 inches. The P-40 accelerated to 320 miles per hour. He positioned himself 4,000 feet above the bomber stream, coming at them from the south with the sun directly behind him. The Oscars had not spotted him yet. Their attention was focused forward on the target. He had one decisive advantage: surprise. The lead Sally bomber group flew in tight formation, 6 aircraft arranged in 2 Vs of 3. Adair rolled inverted for a split second, pulled the nose down, and dove from their 7 o'clock high position. Airspeed built rapidly to 360 miles per hour. The engine screamed at full combat power. Range closed fast. The bomber crews still had not seen him. At 800 yards, he opened fire. All 6.50 caliber Brownings hammered at once. Tracers arced toward the lead bomber. Rounds walked up the left wing. Fabric tore, metal sparked. The port engine erupted in a bright orange fireball. Thick black smoke poured from the cowling. The bomber shuddered and dropped out of formation. The tight V dissolved instantly. Bombers scattered left and right in chaos. Adair pulled up hard, enduring 7 Gs, and rolled right. 40 Oscar fighters were already diving toward him. The Nakajima Ki-43 was one of the most maneuverable fighters in the Pacific Theater, powered by a 1,150 horsepower engine and equipped with butterfly combat flaps that allowed it to bleed speed rapidly in turns without stalling. In the previous 6 months, those Oscars had shot down 63 Allied fighters over Burma and northeast India. Adair's P-40N was faster in a straight line, but could not match the Oscar's turn rate. The Warhawk's Allison V-171 O-81 engine generated 1,240 horsepower at 3,000 RPM, giving a maximum speed of 378 miles per hour below 12,000 feet. But in a sustained turning fight, the heavier American fighter would lose energy faster than the lightweight Japanese aircraft. Standard tactics were clear. Never turn with an Oscar. Hit and run. Extend, reset. Adair could not extend. If he left now, the bombers would reform and finish their attack. He had to keep pressure on the formation, keep them scattered, keep them nervous, even if it meant fighting 40 Oscars alone. The first 4 Oscars came at him in a loose finger-4 formation from his 10 o'clock high. Adair rolled left, pulled the nose up, and fired a 2-second burst at the lead fighter. The rounds missed high. The Oscar broke right. Its wingman followed. Adair reversed, diving away to maintain speed. 2 more Oscars dove from above. He saw them at 400 yards, pulled into a climbing left turn, and fired again. No hits. His ammunition counter showed 800 rounds remaining across all 6 guns, approximately 6 more attacks at his current rate of fire. Behind the fighter screen, the Sally bombers were already attempting to reform. 3 groups of 6 aircraft each were closing back into position. If they achieved their bombing V again, they would press the attack. Adair had perhaps 90 seconds before they reached their release point over Denyon. He rolled out, shoved the throttle to the stop, and dove toward the bombers again. 8 Oscars followed him down. The P-40 accelerated to 405 miles per hour in the dive. The lighter Oscars could not match that speed. Adair opened the gap, pulled out at bomber altitude, and lined up on the right-hand Sally formation at 300 yards. He fired. Tracers converged on the lead bomber's right engine. The Mitsubishi HA-101 radial exploded in a fireball. The bomber rolled right, streaming fire and debris. Its wingman broke formation to avoid collision. Adair kicked rudder, skidded left, and raked another Sally from nose to tail. The thin aluminum skin of the KY-21 offered almost no protection. Rounds punched straight through the fuselage. The formation broke again. Bombers scattered in 3 different directions. Their bombing accuracy was destroyed. Even if they dropped now, the bombs would be spread across miles of jungle instead of concentrated on the airfield. Adair pulled up hard. His coolant temperature gauge showed 248 degrees. The engine was running rough. He could feel vibration through the control stick. Detonation was starting in the cylinders. Pre-ignition from excessive heat. If he did not reduce power soon, the engine would seize. 8 Oscars dove on him from above. He saw them late, rolled left. Too slow. 7.7 millimeter rounds punched through his right wing. Fabric tore, metal buckled. 1 round hit the right aileron control rod. The aileron response went mushy. He needed more right stick pressure to maintain level flight. Another burst walked up his fuselage. Rounds sparked off the engine cowling. 1 penetrated the coolant reservoir behind the firewall. Green coolant sprayed across his windscreen. The engine temperature gauge climbed past 260 degrees. Steam erupted from the cowling seams. His oil pressure dropped. The Allison was dying. Adair chopped the throttle. Engine RPM fell from 3,000 to 2,400. Not enough power to maintain altitude. The P-40 started descending, 1,000 feet per minute, then 1,500. The Oscars were circling above him, waiting. Then the engine caught fire. Burning coolant vaporized and ignited. Flames spread forward along the cowling. Adair had perhaps 30 seconds before the fire reached the fuel lines and the aircraft exploded. Standard procedure was immediate shutdown and bailout, but his altitude was only 8,000 feet, descending rapidly, and he was 12 miles from friendly territory over jungle where Japanese patrols operated. He kept the engine running. He pulled the mixture control back to idle cutoff for 3 seconds, starving the engine of fuel. The fire intensity decreased. He pushed the mixture forward again. The engine coughed, caught, continued running, but rough. Power output had dropped to approximately 60%. Not enough to climb, barely enough to maintain level flight. He was committed to flying home on a burning, damaged engine. The Sally bombers were 13 miles from Denjan, still close enough to turn back, but their formations had disintegrated. Individual bombers were heading southeast toward Burma. The raid was broken. The airfield was safe. Adair turned southwest toward his base at Nguli, 43 miles away. 6 Oscars followed him. At 7,000 feet, his engine oil pressure dropped to 0. The Allison ran on oil pressure to lubricate its connecting rods, crankshaft, and camshaft. Without oil pressure, metal ground against metal. Friction generated heat. Heat caused expansion. Components seized. Adair felt the vibration increase. The propeller began windmilling unevenly. Power output fell further. His airspeed dropped to 180 miles per hour. The P-40's stall speed was 120. He was losing the margin between controlled flight and falling. The Oscars closed to 400 yards. They did not fire. They were watching, waiting for the engine to fail completely. At 6,000 feet, smoke began filling his cockpit from electrical wiring damaged by the rounds that had hit his fuselage. Smoke burned his eyes and throat. He slid the canopy open. The wind blast cleared some of the smoke, but the slipstream made breathing difficult. His airspeed fell to 160 miles per hour. The Oscars backed off. They were not going to waste ammunition. The American pilot was already dead. His aircraft was crippled. He would crash in the jungle. They circled higher, watching him descend. At 4,000 feet, Adair's right aileron control cable snapped. The aileron flopped to full deflection. The P-40 rolled right, and the nose dropped into a dive. He hauled back on the control stick with both hands. Nothing. The elevator cables were damaged. He had no pitch control. The nose stayed down. His airspeed increased. 200 miles per hour, 220, 250. The jungle rushed up at him. Altitude 3,000 feet, 2,500, 2,000. He was going to crash. Then he had an idea. The P-40's damaged aileron was forcing the right wing down. The broken elevator cables left the horizontal stabilizer in a nose-down position. Gravity and aerodynamic forces were pulling the aircraft into an uncontrolled dive. But aerodynamics work in both directions. If he rolled the aircraft inverted, the damaged aileron would force the right wing up instead of down. The elevator stuck in nose-down trim would push the tail down, lifting the nose up. Flying upside down would reverse the control inputs. The damage that was killing him right side up might save him inverted. At 1,800 feet above the jungle, Adair rolled the P-40 completely inverted. -1G pressed him against his shoulder straps. Blood rushed to his head. His vision turned red around the edges. The fuel system, designed for positive G loads, struggled to feed fuel to the engine inverted. The Allison coughed, sputtered, nearly quit, then caught again, running rough but producing power. The nose came up. The descent slowed. At 1,200 feet, the P-40 leveled out, flying upside down at 140 miles per hour. Adair held the inverted attitude for 40 seconds. His airspeed increased to 160. He was climbing slowly, 50 feet per minute, but climbing. Then the fuel starvation problem returned. The engine began cutting out. He rolled right side up. The damaged controls immediately pushed the nose down. The P-40 descended again at 600 feet per minute. Adair waited until he lost 300 feet, then rolled inverted again. The nose came up. He climbed 200 feet before fuel starvation forced him to roll upright. The pattern repeated. Upside down to climb, right side up to let fuel feed properly. Flip, climb, flip, descend. Flip, climb. The 6 Oscars circling above watched this impossible display. An American P-40 with a burning engine and damaged controls, flying alternately inverted and upright, refusing to crash, clawing for altitude with the determination of a wounded animal refusing to die. One Oscar dove to investigate. Adair saw him coming, rolled inverted to gain altitude, then rolled upright directly at the Japanese fighter. The Oscar broke away. The American pilot was either insane or desperate. Either way, the Oscars decided not to engage. They turned east toward Burma. Adair continued his rolling climb toward Nguli. His fuel gauge showed 83 gallons. His oil pressure gauge showed 0. The needle had been pegged at 0 for 9 minutes. The engine should have seized by now. Connecting rods should have welded to the crankshaft. The fact that it still ran defied mechanical logic. The Allison was running on momentum, friction, and whatever microscopic oil film remained on its internal components. His altitude reached 3,000 feet, then 4,000. The base at Nguli was 21 miles southwest, approximately 11 minutes away if he maintained current speed. His coolant temperature gauge no longer registered. The needle had melted off at some point. Smoke still poured from the cowling, but the flames had died down. Either the fire had consumed all available fuel or the lack of coolant had somehow starved it. At 5,000 feet, Adair spotted Nguli airfield ahead, the runway, the tower, the revetments, safety. But he faced a new problem. His landing gear was hydraulic. The hydraulic system ran on engine power. His engine was producing minimal power and might quit completely any second. If he lowered the gear and the engine died, he would crash short of the runway with the gear down. If he kept the gear up and tried a belly landing, the impact might rupture his remaining fuel tanks and the aircraft would burn. He needed the gear down and locked before the engine failed. He reached for the gear lever. His right hand was shaking, not from fear but from carbon monoxide poisoning. The cockpit smoke had been accumulating for 14 minutes. He pulled the gear lever down. Nothing happened. The P-40's hydraulic system operated at 1,000 pounds per square inch. Hydraulic fluid, pressurized by an engine-driven pump, flowed through steel lines to actuators that extended and retracted the landing gear. With the engine producing minimal power, the hydraulic pump was not generating sufficient pressure. The gear remained locked in the up position. The P-40 had a backup system, a manual hand pump mounted on the left side of the cockpit. 28 strokes of the pump handle would manually pressurize the hydraulic system enough to lower the gear. Adair grabbed the pump handle with his left hand, keeping his right hand on the control stick. He pumped. 1, 2, 3. Nothing. The gear stayed up. The hand pump required both hands for effective operation, but releasing the stick meant losing aircraft control. His damaged ailerons and elevator would immediately push the nose down. He reached behind his seat and pulled his lap belt loose, wrapped it around the control stick, looped it through the seat frame, and pulled it tight. The makeshift rig held the stick in approximate neutral position. Not perfect control, but enough to keep the aircraft flying straight. He grabbed the hand pump with both hands and pumped hard. 5 strokes. 10. 15. At stroke 23 he felt resistance, hydraulic pressure building. At stroke 28 He heard a thunk from beneath the cockpit. The left main gear extended and locked. The right main gear followed 3 seconds later. The P-40 was now draggy. Gear down increased drag significantly. His airspeed fell from 160 miles per hour to 135. Still above stall speed, but not by much. The engine was producing perhaps 40% power now, barely enough to maintain altitude with the gear extended. Naguli runway was 7 miles ahead. 3 minutes. His vision tunneled. Gray edges closed in from the periphery. Carbon monoxide poisoning was affecting his brain function. He shook his head, focused on the runway. 6 miles. His engine temperature gauge, the one that still worked, showed 310 degrees, far beyond red line. Metal components inside the engine were expanding from heat. Tolerances were closing. Any second now a piston would seize, or a valve would stick, or a connecting rod would snap. 5 miles. The tower operators at Naguli saw him coming, a P-40 with smoke trailing from the cowling, flying erratically, gear down. They assumed he would make a normal approach, lower the flaps, reduce speed, touch down on the main wheels first. Standard landing procedure. But Adair's flaps were hydraulic too. With minimal engine power, he could not pump enough hydraulic pressure for both gear and flaps. The gear was down. The flaps stayed up. Landing without flaps meant higher landing speed, 120 miles per hour instead of 90. That meant longer landing roll. Naguli's runway was 4,000 feet long. A flapless landing in a damaged aircraft required at least 3,000 feet. Doable if he maintained airspeed, if the engine kept running, if he touched down smoothly. At 2 miles from the runway, his engine quit. The propeller windmilled to a stop. No power, no thrust. The P-40 became a glider, a very poor glider. The Warhawk's glide ratio was approximately 8-to-1. From 2,000 feet altitude, he could glide approximately 3 miles. The runway was 2 miles away. Theoretically possible. But his damaged aircraft had extra drag from the battle damage. Bullet holes in wings and fuselage disrupted airflow. His actual glide ratio was worse than normal, perhaps 6-to-1. He was not going to make the runway. He was going to crash short in the jungle. After surviving 64 Japanese aircraft, after flying inverted for 11 minutes, after nursing a dying engine for 15 miles, he would crash 200 yards from safety because his engine quit at the worst possible moment. Then he remembered something from training, something his instructor had said about P-40 glide performance, something about flying inverted. In a normal glide, an aircraft descends nose first, gravity pulling it downward while wings generate lift. But inverted, the aerodynamics reverse. The wings' camber, designed to generate lift upward when right side up, generates downward force when inverted. However, at specific angles of attack, this reversal creates less drag than right side up flight. An inverted glide could theoretically extend range by reducing drag. The principle had been mentioned briefly during training. No instructor expected pilots to actually use it. Adair had nothing to lose. He rolled inverted at 1,800 feet, 1 mile from the runway. Blood rushed to his head. His vision reeled. He held the inverted attitude, watching the jungle pass beneath him or above him. Perspective became disorienting. The airspeed held steady at 125 miles per hour. The descent rate was 500 feet per minute, better than the 700 feet per minute he had been experiencing right side up. The tower operators at Naguli saw an inverted P-40 approaching with landing gear extended. Gear down while inverted was aerodynamically wrong, structurally stressful. The gear doors designed to handle air loads from below were now subjected to loads from above, but the gear held. The P-40 continued its inverted approach. On the ground, a crew chief named Technical Sergeant Robert Martinez watched through binoculars. He saw the inverted aircraft, saw the gear extended, saw smoke trailing from the engine. His first thought was that a Japanese pilot had stolen a P-40 and was attempting to strafe the field. Martinez ran toward the nearest .50 caliber machine gun position. 3 other ground crew followed him. They reached the gun emplacement and began traversing the weapon toward the approaching aircraft. Adair was at 400 feet altitude, half a mile from the runway threshold, still inverted. His vision was fading. Gray tunnels closed in. Carbon monoxide and negative G-forces were shutting down his brain. He had perhaps 20 seconds of consciousness remaining. He needed to roll upright, line up with the runway, and land. But if he rolled upright too soon, the damaged controls would push the nose down and he would crash short. If he rolled too late, he would overshoot the runway. At 200 feet altitude, 300 yards from the threshold, Adair rolled right side up. The damaged aileron immediately pushed the right wing down. He countered with left stick, fighting the aircraft, forcing the wings level. The nose wanted to drop. He pulled back on the stick. The broken elevator cables gave him partial control. Not much, just enough. The P-40 descended toward the runway at a steep angle, nose high, wings wobbling. Martinez's gun crew tracked the aircraft. The P-40 was definitely damaged. Smoke poured from it. It might be friendly. It might be enemy. In 3 seconds, the aircraft would cross the runway threshold. Martinez had to decide. Shoot or hold fire. He held fire. Adair crossed the threshold at 90 feet, descending rapidly. Too fast, too steep. The P-40 dropped the last 90 feet in 4 seconds. The main wheels hit the concrete runway hard. 7G impact. The gear struts compressed fully. The tail wheel slammed down. Metal shrieked. The right main gear collapsed. The right wing dropped. The wingtip hit the runway and dug in. The aircraft ground-looped right, spinning 180 degrees, throwing up sparks and concrete fragments. It skidded backward for 200 feet and stopped. Smoke billowed from the engine compartment. Fire crews raced toward the aircraft. Adair sat motionless in the cockpit for 12 seconds. Then he released his shoulder straps, stood up, and climbed out onto the wing. His legs buckled. He caught himself on the wing root. Ground crew reached him and helped him down. Martinez arrived with the fire crew. They opened the cowling. The Allison engine was destroyed, pistons seized, crankshaft warped, oil pan ruptured, coolant everywhere. Adair walked around the aircraft with Martinez. They counted the damage. 16 bullet holes in the fuselage, 7 in the right wing, 4 in the left. 1 round had severed the right aileron control cable completely. Another had punctured the hydraulic reservoir. A third had cut through 2 electrical bundles behind the instrument panel. The engine had sustained catastrophic damage from overheating and oil starvation. Every cylinder showed scoring. 3 connecting rods were welded to the crankshaft. The coolant system was destroyed. Lulu Bell would never fly again, but Philip Adair had saved Denjan Airfield. Intelligence reports confirmed that all 24 Sally bombers had turned back without dropping their ordnance. The Japanese formation had scattered 15 miles short of the target. 40 Oscar fighters had escorted empty bombers back to Burma. 0 bombs hit Allied facilities, 0 casualties on the ground. 14 C-47 transports remained operational. The hump airlift continued without interruption. On December 16, 1943, 3 days after the mission, 10th Air Force Headquarters interviewed Adair about the engagement. He described the attack sequence, the inverted flying technique, the landing approach. Flight surgeons examined him. Carbon monoxide levels in his blood were still elevated 72 hours after the mission. They determined he had been flying with severe poisoning for the final 11 minutes of the flight. That level of impairment should have rendered him unconscious. He had somehow remained functional through will alone. On January 8, 1944, Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell, commander of U.S. Forces, China-Burma-India Theater, presented Second Lieutenant Philip Adair with the Silver Star. The citation read, "For gallantry in action against enemy forces on December 13, 1943, when Lieutenant Adair, flying alone, engaged and disrupted a formation of 64 enemy aircraft attacking Allied installations, continuing his attack despite severe aircraft damage and personal injury, thereby preventing destruction of critical supply facilities." Adair flew 95 more combat missions with the 80th Fighter Group. He achieved ace status with 5 confirmed kills. On his final mission in July 1944, he shot down 2 KY-43 Oscars over northern Burma. He returned to the United States in September 1944, survived the war, and remained in the Air Force for 30 years. He retired as a full colonel in 1971. The 80th Fighter Group, the Burma Banshees, continued operations until August 1945. The unit destroyed 413 Japanese aircraft in aerial combat and 147 on the ground. They lost 63 pilots killed or missing. Their death's head skull insignia became one of the most recognized markings in the China-Burma-India theater. The P-40 Warhawk never achieved the fame of the P-51 Mustang or P-47 Thunderbolt. It was slower than both. It could not fight effectively above 15,000 feet. By 1943 it was considered obsolete, but in the hands of determined pilots like Philip Adair, the rugged Curtiss fighter proved what mattered most in combat was not the aircraft's specifications. It was the courage and skill of the pilot flying it. One pilot, one obsolete fighter, 64 enemy aircraft, December 13, 1943. Philip Adair proved that impossible odds mean nothing when someone refuses to quit. His solution to damaged controls, flying alternately inverted and upright for 11 minutes, defied every standard flying procedure. His inverted landing approach with gear extended had never been attempted before and was never repeated. That is the story of the Burma Banshees and the day one P-40 pilot disrupted an entire Japanese raid.